What makes us pay our taxes? Well, new research, in cooperation with the Swedish Tax Agency, investigates whether giving delinquent taxpayers a nudge increases compliance. Hello, Henrik.
Hello.
And Katarina, welcome as well.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Henrik, first of all, I would have assumed that Swedish people are pretty good at paying their taxes. How big a problem is non-payment in Sweden?
I think your assumption is fairly correct. I don't know if I would phrase it as we are good at paying taxes, but for sure, the majority of Swedes pay their taxes and they pay them on time. So, if that's the requirement for whether or not we think this is an issue, then maybe it's not that big of an issue. I think it becomes a big issue when you start thinking about how severe the consequences are for the people who actually don't end up paying their taxes. Because, well, at least in the Swedish case, there is an enforcement agency that handles these cases where people don't pay their taxes. And that can be pretty serious, the consequences of ending up with the enforcement agency. So you're subject to a payment default, and it will be very difficult for you to enter economic transactions or economic agreements and get a mortgage. You will have an extra fine upon you. So the consequences for those who actually end up not paying on time can be quite severe. And I think that's the reason why we think this is a big issue, even in Sweden. So.
Now, to investigate the consequences of different methods of trying to get people to pay their taxes, I would have thought to do that rigorously, you have to be able to find out what happens when you have no enforcement at all. How can you do that?
Yeah, it's a very good question. In this case, we're quite lucky that there is some variation in enforcement in the tax agency, and there is a bit of a peculiarity, maybe you can say. So not everyone who owes the tax agency money actually gets enforced. So there is a quite sharp discontinuity or cutoff, if you may. So if you owe the tax agency 2,000 Swedish crowns or more, then you will get, by the end of the year, by the end of the tax year, you will get a letter of enforcement. You will get a letter, basically, you could say it threatens you with enforcement, that says that if you don't end up paying this money within a certain amount of time, then we will transfer your debt to the enforcement agency. And as I already spoke about, that can be very, very serious for people. But if you have less than 2,000 Swedish crowns, which is about 200 euro, something like that. If you have less than 2,000 Swedish crowns in debt, then you simply get a reminder. So at this distinct cutoff, there is a very, very harsh treatment of enforcement. So essentially, by just comparing those people who have debt just over 2,000 Swedish crowns to those who have debt just under 2,000 Swedish crowns, and looking at what's the tendency to pay your debt into the tax agency, you can draw pretty strong conclusions about what's the effect of enforcement, because this becomes basically a local randomized experiment. We can assume, and we show this to some great detail in the paper, that it's more or less random whether you have 1,950 in debt or whether you have 2,050 in debt. It's more or less random. So, and then what we see, of course, is that the people who have just above 2,000 Swedish crowns, they get this letter of this threat of enforcement. They pay about 10 percentage points more, or their probability of paying is about 10 percentage points higher than those just below the cutoff. And then if you add on to that, those who actually get transferred to the enforcement agency, so you have an actual enforcement, then you add yet another 10 percentage points in payment probability. So there's a quite sharp effect of this enforcement, and we would expect so really from any basic economic theory about people reacting to incentives. We would expect so, I would say.
So the standard treatment, the sort of treatment that people get from tax offices all over the world is working. It's, as you say, it's working pretty well. People are reacting to it. You experimented with using a nudge, a behavioral nudge, didn't you? What's the economic theory behind this? How does it work?
It shouldn't work. I mean, according to standard economic theory, a nudge shouldn't work because it lacks all economic meaning. So, and then, so therefore, I mean, someone who is really rational and optimizing should not be affected at all by a nudge. But there are psychological effects making these nudges work. And that is because we are not always completely rational. One of the nudges that we tested was just a completely non-informative cover letter. So we just added a piece of paper just saying that here comes a reminder that you have to pay your taxes. And of course, I mean, that was exactly the letter that was sent. And for those who did not risk enforcement upon not payment, I mean, they increased their likelihood of payment almost as much as from this threat that Henrik talked about, which means that okay, something it just caught their attention as perhaps I have to pay, and they did. While for those who were at risk of enforcement, there we did not find that effect because it was potentially a more important decision for them because I mean more was at stake, and perhaps they were thinking a little bit more about this decision, and therefore a nudge was not effective.
Now, that this non-informative, I mean, the gentlest of nudges possible that you sent out, it wasn't the only one, was it? There were other treatments as well. What else did you do?
Yeah, so we also sent one letter that we actually borrowed from a British study that has become very influential, where they use something that they call a minority norm, stating that, and in our case, we said that more than 9 out of 10 people, they pay their taxes on time, and you belong to the minority who has not done that yet. And so here is a reminder that you ought to do this. And we compare that then to those just non-informative letters, and we get another 2 percentage point roughly who actually pay their taxes. And interestingly enough, the effect from this minority norm letter, I mean, reminding them of the social norm of actually paying the taxes, that has an effect both for those who do not risk enforcement and for those who do. So the non-informative, it seems like that only works for them who did not risk enforcement. But the social norm actually had an effect on both. And for those who were at risk of enforcement, there we also had another treatment where we checked one letter that just gave a very brief description of what does enforcement really mean, because it could be that not everyone actually understands the full consequences of this. And we got also an extra effect of that one.
So this is working pretty well. You're getting an effect here in many cases, but it's something that people get. They open up while having breakfast, they hold up the letter and they read it. I communicate with the UK tax office only in email. If you did the same thing over email, would it work as well?
Yes, for some. We actually did. It's not in the paper, but we actually did because lots of Swedes, they also communicate just electronically with the tax agency. So we could actually compare those who received physical letters and those who received emails. And this non-informative cover letter, just an extra sheet in the envelope, that was only effective among those who got a physical letter. But these social norm reminding people that most people actually pay their taxes and you belong to the minority who don't, that effect was about the same for those who received an electronic letter and a physical letter.
I imagine these are pretty cheap messages to send out. They seem to be working. Does this mean that what we're doing with nudges is achieving a permanent increase in the tax revenues that you are able to take in Sweden?
No, I mean, I think it depends a bit on what we assume about the mechanisms here. Because what we would have to assume is that we can do this over and over again to kind of increase payment. So if we assume that what people are reacting to is some kind of salience, then maybe we could do it over and over again. But if this is people at this point in time reacting to something which is kind of unexpected or something new, then maybe we can't do that over and over again. But it has led to, we should say that it has led to some work at the tax agency where they're actually trying to kind of communicate in a different way with the taxpayers as kind of an inspiration from the results of the study. So at least there is a belief, I think, within the tax agency that there might be increases in tax payments using these simple nudges.
How typical do you think that Swedish people's response to these nudges is? Would it work in other countries which have historically lower compliance, or countries that have particular problems with compliance from particular sectors of the population? Does the fact that you've got a result here, does this translate?
It's always difficult to take one result from one context and directly translate it into another context. But there have been similar studies in other places as well. When it comes to this more social norm, when we tell people that, okay, more than 9 out of 10 pay their taxes on time and you belong to the minority who has not done that. As I said, that we have borrowed that formulation from another study, and there are several studies that have actually done that, and the results differ. But then we can also, the comparison that we do also in the paper between these mild nudges and the standard threat of enforcement, there we also think that we can draw a more general conclusion, because we know that we have a very good kind of identification when it comes to our threat of enforcement, because it's so very clear cut, as Henrik explained initially. And we also know that it's a very credible threat. That, I mean, those who receive the letter that you will be sent to the enforcement agency if you don't pay. If they don't pay, 100% of them actually end up there. So we know that this is a credible threat. And then we see also that, okay, this pure nudge, just a non-informative letter that has an effect of the same magnitude, then we would expect that to hold also in other countries where, as a comparison to the enforcement threat.
Well, it's fascinating to see the nuances of this nudge theory used in real life, and it's fascinating to hear about the effects as well. Thank you very much, Henrik.
Thank you.
And Katarina as well.
Thank you very much.
9 out of 10 people who are interested in behavioural nudges would want to download the paper at this point. It's called Nudges and Threats, Evidence from Sweden on the Impact of Soft and Hard Incentives for Tax Compliance. And the link to download it from is on screen now. Also, if you want to watch the recent session at the 76th Economic Policy Panel, at which this paper was presented, you can use the same link to find it. Well, thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.